This is looking at an image of every tropical storm or stronger tropical cyclone that has come through the Atlantic basin since 1851 through 2019. And as you can see, there's a lot. Almost so many on here over the last century and a half plus. It's hard to even make out, land features in here. If you zoom in, it gets even more ridiculous. They're colored here by their strength. I'm looking kind of right over the Gulf of Mexico, and it's just, it looks like a Jackson Pollock painting or something like that. And what this goes to show you is that, given enough time, quite a few storms are going to populate this map, over hundreds of years. But it's also, as a base in the Atlantic, pretty efficient at producing these storms, particularly late in the summer through early fall when that season really reaches its peak. And as we kind of move through summer here, we are getting closer and closer to that peak, and we've seen kind of a fast start to the year already. Now, that doesn't always necessarily correlate with a strong peak of season in terms of the total hurricane season and how it evolves, but it can. It has in past years as well, and the most kind of recent, very, very active one was in 2020. Now, this is a map we can and it's a little easier to look at and see around. The biggest, or perhaps the most strongest hurricane that made landfall in the United States was Laura, which came through southwest Louisiana. Very active year, a lot of systems. Fortunately, many of these are what we call these fish storms. So out into the Atlantic, disturbing nothing but fish. Sorry, we call them fish storms. The ones we prefer because we can look at cool satellite imagery of them, and they're not a threat to life and property. But unfortunately, some did come a little bit closer to landfall, and we had to deal with that. Now, I bring this up because we are looking at what's likely to be another active hurricane season. And it's really kind of already getting into it now at the end of June, going into July as well, with some storms that we've already seen. What I'm showing you here, this is sea surface temperature anomalies from the same date that I'm recording this, so June 28th, from 2020. So what did those sea surface temperatures look like going into what ended up being one of our most active years on record? Well, we see a developing La Nina in the Eastern Pacific, and I'll pull up my little brush here, make that a little bit more clear. See that cold water here in the Eastern Pacific developing, moving west into the Central Pacific. That's kind of classic, kind of hallmark of a developing La Nina, which we were developing into as we went through the year in 2020. We see this North Pacific warm blob here, and we know hurricanes, particularly in the Atlantic, right? They want that warm ocean water. That's fuel for their growth and their development. And if you look over in the tropical Atlantic, very warm, anomalously warm water, serving as fuel for what would be, ultimately a very strong hurricane season. Now, I'm going to jump forward. Let's look and compare that to this year in 2024. And just kind of quickly, a few differences you can see, certainly if you flip back and forth, but not enough, right, to make me feel good about where we're headed in this hurricane season. So if we kind of recap here, okay, we have a weaker developing La Nina here in the Eastern Pacific. We have that North Pacific warm blob. The water temperatures in the Atlantic, even through the Gulf of Mexico, are even warmer, more anomalously warm than they were in 2020, which was already setting up for a pretty big year. So a few things are coming together here that are making us particularly concerned for what's likely to be an active hurricane season. I will put a disclaimer on that. Hurricane kind of seasonal forecasting for storms that have yet to even form is difficult, and these forecasts are not perfect. So while the ingredients can be there, before kind of everything gets underway, it's hard to be too confident and say the number of storms or the exact area that they're going to make landfall, or to put a warning out for a specific city. It's just not something we can do with this much lead time. We do know the ingredients going into a season that tend to favor more active seasons, and they are certainly all kind of flashing on the board, if you will, right now. Colorado State puts out a very reputable hurricane seasonal forecast, kind of this monthly cadence as we go through summer. Their latest forecast is now calling for 23 named storms in 2024. Our average in a given year over the last 30 years is about 14, so almost 10 storms more than average this year, tropical storm strength or stronger. Unfortunately, that includes 5 major hurricanes. We typically, in a given year, only deal with about 3 of those. Now, it only takes one major hurricane making landfall to cause a tremendous amount of issues. So grappling with 5 anywhere in the Atlantic is going to make a big news story. So this is something we're going to keep an eye on. It could have impacts. We have a lot of production, ports in New Orleans and across the Gulf Coast, refineries, etc. That these can cause issues to kind of immediately on the coast. Of course, storm surge, flooding, and then rainfall. I think sometimes this rainfall comes in at the end of summer. That has its own implications. You start pushing these in through kind of October in that time frame, and it becomes maybe a harvest issue as some have come up through the Corn Belt or certainly the Mid-Atlantic in past years. Just out of curiosity, I went back and looked at their June forecast update from 2020, and they were pretty good that year too, kind of around the same time period, talking about the transition to weak La Nina conditions. By later this summer, we have that kind of same situation developing in the Pacific. Talked about sea surface temperatures across the tropical Atlantic are above normal, and ended up predicting a pretty above average year for hurricanes, and that ended up being a good forecast. So that's where we stand now. If we look down at the Atlantic Basin, this is the visible satellite imagery here. We can already see, even for late June, where we typically don't have a tremendous amount of activity, there are some areas of interest here. Perhaps the most nearest one to land is this cluster of storms that has formed here in the Caribbean, nearing the Yucatan Peninsula. And right now, this is expected to just continue rather weakly, likely not going to form into an organized storm, but it could as it moves across the Yucatan and in toward the east coast of Mexico. The other perhaps more notable storm, but much further away, is this potential system here has not been named yet or classified as a tropical storm. You can see that spinning way out in what we call the main development region of the Atlantic, and that one certainly has our eye right now as well. If you jump over and look at the National Hurricane Center, nhc.noaa.gov, fantastic resource for hurricane forecasting and impacts here. See, they've highlighted that area of storms here in the Caribbean for potential development, but that yellow being a lower chance for development specifically. Kind of hover over that 30% chance of cyclone formation in 7 days, but this is likely to move through the area in just about 48 to 72 hours here. That center storm that we're looking at, 90% chance of cyclone formation in 7 days. That one much more probable is kind of entering our concern as it makes its way over into our neck of the woods. Now that's going to take some time, as much as a week even. So too early to call for specific forecasts in terms of what threat this might pose. Only a 90% chance of formation, so likely looking at a storm here through the next 48 hours. And we'll just kind of have to reassess and see where we go. And then unfortunately, looks like another system behind that could develop over that kind of same main development region. So this is an active start to the year, something that we'll have to watch. Taking a closer look to that center storm, the one that was highlighted in red for a 90% chance of development, looks to be well on its way, just as kind of a rough glance. Now, not a tremendous amount of thunderstorm activities, but it is centered over that center of circulation. You can kind of see these clouds spiraling in here. There's the center somewhere in there with thunderstorms wrapping around it. So kind of skeletal, as I call it at times. You can kind of exposing these bands here. You can see the cloud field moving up like that. But nonetheless, a compact, tight system that might be on its way to being named over the next kind of 24 hours here. One way we track these, this is the ECMWF forecast for low pressure centers from the ensemble. So a number of different ensemble members are run out into the future here, and it gives us different scenarios as to when and kind of where that storm might form and then how strong it is. And it gives us a sense for where the model's kind of leaning in one way or the other and how much uncertainty there is. If I take this forecast out into Sunday evening, you can see that storm we were watching there, or the cluster of storms moving across the Yucatan, perhaps making landfall as a weak to even below system here, or below tropical storm strength system in eastern Mexico. But if you look closer to the Lesser Antilles, you can see that system now. A number of these different members have an organized system, potentially tropical storm strength or higher, moving through that area in the far eastern Caribbean. And then by Tuesday, Wednesday, much greater spread in the models here. You notice some of them taking the storm north of Hispaniola, some of them staying in the southern Caribbean, some of these fairly strong in that region down there for Wednesday of next week. If I take this further, you can see some of these have developed and taken the storm out to sea. That's generally our preferred destination if they are going to develop strongly. Some of these making landfall even into parts of Central America. And a few of these, I don't want to call this a forecast by any means, but a few of these trying to near the Yucatan channel where they could become more of a problem or concern. Now I say that, there's a date at the top right of this forecast. We're all the way out into next Friday evening. So this is now a 7-day forecast for a hurricane. It's just not kind of a reasonable distance that we can have for accuracy. So at the very least, what this forecast shows us is this is something we have to keep an eye on over the next kind of 5 to 7 days here to see how it develops and where it might impact, but certainly something that's on our radar. Another kind of quirk we've seen to the fast start, I think, to the hurricane season here in June and then getting into July is there's been a lot of moisture pumping into the desert Southwest. So we've seen a fast start to the monsoon season there. We're looking down here just at Friday afternoon precipitable water anomalies. I'll take this in through the evening here. And it's just showing us where there's anomalous moisture in the atmosphere relative to this date here at the end of June. And it's over the desert Southwest, parts of northwestern Mexico. And as I take this forecast out into the future, you can see it kind of pumping in here. As each of these kind of weak systems come in, they help rejuvenate that moisture in the desert Southwest, and that's helped them get a fast start to their monsoon season. And that's likely to continue. I'm taking this forecast out into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you can see this continual moisture will provide more fuel for thunderstorms developing over parts of the higher elevations in the Southwest. Look over the last 14 days of anomalous rainfall. Of course, we've talked quite a bit, unfortunately, about the northern Midwest flooding, but there's been that active monsoon that we talked about starting up, and some of these systems coming through southern Texas. Saw the flooding, unfortunately, in southern Florida that did remove their drought. You go to the northern portions of the state and in through the southeast, the mid-Atlantic. This area here has been much drier than normal. One reason I think for a lot of what we just discussed has been this squashed high pressure system here centered over eastern Texas, parts of Arkansas here. And if you just kind of follow this clockwise flow around, you can see it helping to guide that Atlantic moisture up into the Southwest. And that's partially why we've seen that monsoon season get going. Some of these storms fire up, the remnants then push across the plains, and at times that has served as kind of an excitement for additional activity over parts of the Corn Belt that we've seen in the last week or so. So this ridge dominating a lot of the pattern here, positioned over the southern plains and the southeast. It's also been preventing storms and precipitation from getting into regions here, helping it dry out and warmth to move in. So that's another kind of aspect of this that we've been watching. As a result, if we look down at the National Weather Service, their all hazards map as of this morning, just before lunchtime central, you can see the heat advisories and excessive heat warnings out for parts of the southern plains, so northern Texas, OKC, eastern Oklahoma, heat advisory stretching over to the Mississippi River Valley, and then this dark red color that you can see here over in California. That is not an excessive heat warning, it is an excessive heat watch. So looking at the potential for a heat wave at kind of the hottest part of the year here, early next week for California. We'll get into that in just a second. So the watch is, keep an eye out for conditions in the future, and not an immediate kind of today heat threat, but something we're watching early next week. And then again, we talked about that flooding in the areas near in and around Sioux Falls, and you can see the river flood advisories that are out and the flood warnings for that. Another thing we've been tracking, if we have that ridge over the southern plains, kind of roughly looking like that, you expect ridge riding thunderstorms to form along that. In summer, that's a pretty common pattern that we expect. Now, that kind of daytime monsoonal activity is yet to pick up here just before lunchtime. But being on the kind of periphery of that ridge, this is an area that we would expect in the Four Corners to continue to light up with showers and thunderstorms in the afternoon. Coming around the top of that ridge, we can see the remnants of yesterday's storms. We can see a low pressure system spinning down through Montana here. So the ridge here, we see this kind of activity on the flanks of these kind of ridge riding storms moving around it. So that'll be kind of a continued area of focus as we go through the forecast and watch the position of that ridge. Drought monitor map that was updated yesterday. Some notable areas here, watching the continuation of the southwest drought, but this is improving with that monsoonal activity. And then growing concern here for the southeast, parts of the Carolinas, getting up into Virginia, even northern Florida. This area is looking at some more thunderstorm activity. We just saw that on the radar that we walked through. But certainly this area here with that ridge kind of parked and oscillating between the southeast and the southern plains, this area here looking at more heat and dryness. Now we've had a lot of rain in here just over the kind of last 30 and 60 days. This is an area that was below average and is increasingly so in the forecast. If we look at soil moistures, this is just through the root zone. NASA estimated. If you look at the southwest, it jumps out. They've had quite a bit of anomalous rainfall here for the early start to that monsoon season. You have this area here in Oklahoma where we have soil moisture deficits, and then the northern Florida, Carolinas drought really standing out looking at these soil moistures. Still have some recovery I think we could do here in parts of the eastern Corn Belt. Have had some good rains come in here just over the last week. That has been beneficial. There's likely some acreage in here that could use more of this, certainly going into pollination here for corn as we go into July. Want to take a look at the forecast going out into the future. This is from the 3-kilometer NAM, which can resolve those individual thunderstorms. Of course, we just saw that position of that ridge. We're going to expect, I would think, thunderstorms and activity to fire around it like that. So if I take this forecast through today into Friday afternoon and evening, you can see the potential for thunderstorms to fire here in parts of eastern Kansas, perhaps northern Iowa, pushing into Wisconsin. You even see some activity trying to come out of Colorado. See some of that spotty daytime shower and thunderstorm activity over the Four Corners region. And have seen some of this. So along the kind of eastern periphery of that ridge, some storms trying to fire here in parts of the southeast, giving some relief to rather localized locations, not a drought buster by any means. And some of those have been weaker than advertised, unfortunately, over the last week. So can't put a lot of trust in that rainfall right now. But there is some spotty shower chances for the southeast and storm chances through the day today. So going into Saturday morning, you can see some of the remnants of these storm systems moving through parts of the northeast, kind of in coordination with the jet stream that's moving through here above that ridge that we just talked about. Looking at the potential for more storms, certainly, as we go through the day into Saturday and Saturday evening, potentially firing here across parts of the Mid-South and into the southern plains. You can see more of that Four Corners shower and thunderstorm activity toward the southwest. Take this forecast even into Sunday. Again, you can almost see that ridge here, maybe anchoring more over the southern plains, just kind of basing that off where we're seeing these storms fire up, and then potentially more here in eastern Montana through the day on Sunday. Just looking at the day one convective outlook from the Storm Prediction Center, see they've circled a rather wide slight risk area here across the central plains, parts of the western Corn Belt. We saw those storms potentially firing as far as eastern Colorado, saw the NAM trying to blow it up near Kansas City. It's hard to believe any kind of one model run in terms of where these individual storms are going to fire and threaten, but certainly I think this wide risk is warranted just based on how many storms we saw flare up in the afternoon here today, likely fairly soon. If you look at the 72-hour precipitation forecast, this is just the total forecast here over the next 3 days from the ECMWF. We can see kind of that day one risk area almost circled here with some of these stronger rainfall or higher rainfall totals. And then you can see too along the periphery of that ridge where kind of these spotty thunderstorms are going. So this is kind of your typical ridge riding pattern that we're going to be following in summer to see who gets some of these thunderstorms, even if they're a little bit spottier. I'll take this forecast in through Friday afternoon. This is the upper level height map. Just want to follow the position of the ridge and then the troughs as they come through as a focus for activity. Now, looking at this map here from the ECMWF, this forecast, that 500 millibar ridge, not the strongest. Right now we don't see those kind of widespread heat advisories and heat warnings, but it is there, and that's why we're seeing some precipitation trying to sneak into parts of the southeast. Troughs moved through here this weekend through the northern plains. We saw some of that activity, and that really allows that ridge, after that moves toward the east, to build over parts of the central and southern plains. So more heat coming, unfortunately, for folks in Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and likely up through parts of the central plains here going in through the weekend. We do see a weak trough coming through the west. So take this forecast into Monday. See another trough developing over the northwest, likely focusing some storm activity here out ahead of it, potentially moving through parts of the Corn Belt, perhaps the northern Midwest, going through the week next week. But unfortunately, you can see that ridge anchoring now again over the southeast, likely to bring back hot conditions toward the southeast, bringing rainfall out of the situation, less storms and shower activity for the Carolinas, areas that do not need more heat stress right now. If you look over to the west, another big story developing is this upper level ridge pushing into parts of Oregon and California. So that is the heat wave that we talked about early next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, really getting going out west, and that has prompted those excessive heat watches. Look at the 5-day anomaly precipitation from the ECMWF here. I centered this, I have it ending on Saturday, so you can think of it as a 5-day kind of work week precipitation forecast for next week. And you can see, because of that trough coming through, that ridge setting up over the central plains, see a lot of ridge riding northwest flow thunderstorms moving through parts of the Midwest. Could be spotty at times. You'll notice some like little dry areas in here, but pretty good coverage across a wide area. Essentially what you draw is parts of the central, eastern, and northern Corn Belt here going through the next work week. I want to take a look at those temperatures here as we track the position of that ridge and then the heat wave out west. So this is the high temperature anomalies for Friday. And you can see the areas here that had heat advisories and heat warnings over the southern plains. If I take this into Saturday, you can see that trough moving through the Midwest and the storm activity associated with that. And then again, early next week, we talked about that ridge really setting up again over the Central Plains, heat coming for Oklahoma, Kansas, up into Nebraska, and then unfortunately Texas lingering in the southeast as well. So that strengthens on Tuesday and Wednesday. It starts to move toward the east, and that brings in more of the southeast, the mid-south, even the mid-Atlantic under higher heat anomalies for daytime temperatures. And then we can see that heat wave really getting going now in California for folks in the Central Valley, southern portions of the state. However, while we often see heat waves here in California in concert with heat waves here across the Southwest, that monsoon activity actually keeping temperatures a little bit below average. And it feels silly to say that staring at a 100 degree or 110 degree Fahrenheit temperature forecast here for next Wednesday. For southern Arizona, that's not too crazy, seasonal, if not a little bit chillier for, their hottest part of their year. Take the forecast once out more into Thursday, one more day, and you can see some of that heat moving up into the Pacific Northwest now as well, troughing over the northern plains. You can just kind of imagine looking at more precipitation over parts of the Midwest, perhaps the northern plains as well, as that trough moves through next week, getting out close to a 7-day forecast here, so confidence fading, but unfortunately still seeing that kind of oscillating ridge, right, moving between the southern plains and the southeast, keeping that drought risk going for folks in the Carolinas, Georgia, northern Florida. Just looking for a difference of opinion here from the GFS model, and can see this is again that 5-day work week forecast next week. You can see that activity moving through the northern Midwest. A little bit of a drier position here or forecast for northern Illinois, northern Indiana, southern Michigan. Hard to pick out, in what is essentially a 7-day forecast. Whether this is picking on something real, probably just the kind of hit and miss nature of the thunderstorms as they come through on that ridge riding pattern. We can see that activity in the southwest. And then with some of that kind of spotty storms coming up, there are folks likely, maybe even parts of the Carolinas and Georgia, that will pick up some healthy rainfall amounts. It's just not likely to be widespread, unfortunately. I want to take that ridge forecast further out into the future, just give a nice idea where we might be going in July. We talked about that heat wave, the ridge responsible for that in the western U.S. Unfortunately, as that trough's moving through the northern plains, we also see that ridge developing over the southeast. This is what we just looked at kind of near the end of next week when we're getting to the end of that kind of forecast confidence. Unfortunately, right now I don't see enough to kind of shake this pattern around. I think we continue to see this kind of quick start to the monsoon season with this ridge moving between the southern plains and the southeast. That's allowed this flow and the moisture to return up into the Four Corners region. Now, with the momentum that we've seen out of the Pacific, I don't know how much staying power this ridging and the heat has in the western U.S. We have seen some warmer waters push in a little bit more into parts of the Gulf of Alaska and the Northeast Pacific. If that continues to happen, this heat risk might shift for the west. Just haven't seen enough evidence of that yet. So with a lot of the momentum that we've seen out of the jet stream, would expect this to be, hopefully a shorter lasting heat wave, just based on how transient this pattern has been. What I'm not seeing is anything to kind of shake up this ridge that we've seen here across parts of the southern United States that's kept heat in this area and rainfall to a minimum. I think perhaps one reason we're still seeing that momentum in the jet stream, even here at the end of June and getting into early July, is that we're not quickly diving into a La Nina, perhaps, as some of these models thought. We saw El Nino conditions fading quickly through April and into May. Kind of the general thinking was if this continues, we'd be at La Nina conditions, maybe by July or August. But we've seen this stalling out that you can see really since we got into June. That hasn't changed. If anything, we've warmed up the waters just a tad in the Central Pacific. It's not seeing La Nina develop nearly as quickly. That's probably playing a role in that jet stream being a little bit more active. Taking one last look at sea surface temperatures as I wrap up here. Again, if we saw La Nina developing, I showed you that 2020 map. And I can take you all the way back to the beginning what a kind of proper developing La Nina looks like. You can see much cooler waters here stretching across the Central Pacific in late June, and we're just not seeing that this year in 2024. Even though we have the warm Atlantic, we have the warm North Pacific, which is typically coincides with that strengthening La Nina. Not seeing right now, and that's not to say it can't redevelop and increase in intensity later here this summer. Just not seeing that pattern right now, and this likely is all playing into more activity coming out of the Pacific Northwest, perhaps knocking down that heat wave as we go through the work week next week. I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching today, and Eric will be with you all next week.